You were never supposed to come back. They tossed her bag in front of everyone. Then the Medal of Honor hit the floor. They didn't know who she was. Not really. All they saw was a new transfer. Auburn ponytail, calm face, quiet footsteps, no unit patch, no fanfare. So when she walked into the hangar, dragging a weathered canvas pack behind her, no one moved until someone laughed. Fresh meat. The corporal yanked the pack from her shoulder. No warning, no respect, and tossed it across the floor. It skidded, thumped, and something rolled out, small, bronze, deadly still, the Medal of Honor. And in that moment, the room forgot how to breathe. She didn't flinch, didn't scramble to explain, just stared at the medal like it wasn't even hers. But deep inside that silence was a secret, one that could unravel careers, bury reputations, and drag the past screaming back into the present. Because if they knew why she had it, they wouldn't just be stunned. They'd be terrified. Her name was Sergeant Elena Cross, but that meant nothing at Fort Harrison. To them, she was just a reassignment, some Pentagon puppet polish for press conferences and photo ops. What they didn't know was that she'd vanished from active duty without explanation. No farewell, no funeral, just a classified incident at Forward Operating Base Blackstone and silence. Now she was back. Not for redemption, not for recognition. She came for something else, something darker. They mocked her in whispers, made bets on why she had the medal. Stolen valor, government stunt, lover's gift. No one dared to ask her directly until one bold recruit, the same one who tossed her pack, muttered just loud enough, must have found it in a pawn shop. She turned just once. Her eyes weren't angry. They were sad. You should ask the 7 men who didn't make it back, she said. They might disagree. And just like that, the hangar fell silent again. Only this time, it stayed that way. Tension grew like rust. Silent, spreading, dangerous. Rumors became stories, became suspicion. The base's top squad, led by Staff Sergeant Monroe, refused to work with her. She's all shine, no substance, he barked. She'll get someone killed. So when a joint combat exercise was announced, Monroe insisted on leading, but command had other plans. Cross was in charge, and when she showed up with nothing but a sidearm, a radio, and those unreadable eyes, the whispers turned into warnings. No one trusted her, yet none of them could look away. The operation began like any other. Simulated insurgents, urban terrain, 2 teams, 1 target. By hour 2, Cross's team was lost. GPS scrambled. Radios jammed. Monroe smirked. She'd fail. He'd prove his point, and her medal would be a punchline by noon. But Cross didn't panic. She scanned the rooftops, checked the wind, read the terrain like a diary, then whispered, "They're not jamming us. They're hurting us." Within 10 minutes, she rerouted her unit, cut off Monroe's squad, and captured the objective flawlessly. The evaluators called it tactical genius. Monroe called it luck. But Cross, she said nothing at all. That night, a file slid under her door. No name, no return address. Inside, satellite photos, redacted reports, and one chilling sentence written in ink only she recognized. It was the handwriting of her former colonel, the one she saved, the one who nominated her for the Medal of Honor, the one who tried to have her erased. She sat in silence for a long time, then stood and began making copies. At 0700, she walked into the mess hall wearing the same uniform, same quiet steps. But this time, every pair of eyes was on her. She didn't speak right away. She didn't have to. She placed the Medal of Honor on Monroe's tray, then the file, and said calmly, "You want the truth. Here it is." She turned to the rest of the hall. "I didn't ask for the medal. I didn't ask to be sent home. I asked to finish the mission. But instead, they buried it. Buried me." Silence again. But this one was different. Respectful, heavy, real. One by one, soldiers stood. No orders, no protocol, just a salute. Even Monroe, teeth clenched, couldn't look her in the eye. Within a week, investigations began. Her former colonel retired quietly, quickly. And Elena Cross, she turned down her reinstatement, turned down the PR offers, the book deals, the speaking tours. Instead, she chose something else. She stayed at Fort Harrison, training those who still believed that courage isn't loud. It's not in medals. It's in moments, quiet ones, where you stand up, even when no one wants you to. Especially then, they thought she was just another pretty face with a pretty medal. But when they tossed her pack in front of everyone, they didn't just reveal her past, they unleashed it. The mess hall had become a courtroom, and Elena Cross was both judge and witness. The file she placed on Monroe's tray contained 3 years of carefully documented evidence. Supply contracts that didn't add up, weapons shipments that disappeared, intelligence reports that were buried before they reached the right hands. Her team at Forward Operating Base Blackstone hadn't just stumbled onto a weapons cache. They'd uncovered a network that reached all the way back to Fort Harrison, back to the colonel who'd pinned that medal on her chest while knowing he'd already signed her death warrant. The 7 men who didn't make it back weren't casualties of war. They were casualties of greed. Monroe's hands shook as he opened the file. His face went pale as he read the first page, then the second. Around the mess hall, the silence deepened. Soldiers who'd been eating breakfast pushed their trays away. This wasn't just about one woman's hidden past anymore. This was about every mission they'd ever trusted, every order they'd ever followed, every brother and sister they'd lost in the field. Cross closed the file slowly, her auburn ponytail catching the fluorescent lights overhead. She looked at Monroe, then at the faces staring back at her from every table in the mess hall. These weren't just soldiers anymore. They were people who'd trusted a system that had betrayed them, people who'd lost friends to lies disguised as orders. The investigation that followed shook Fort Harrison to its foundations. Military police arrived within hours, black SUVs rolling through the gates like storm clouds. Colonel Davidson, the man who'd once called Elena Cross his finest soldier, found himself in handcuffs before noon. The evidence she'd gathered over 18 months of careful surveillance painted a picture that horrified even the most cynical investigators. Weapons meant for Forward Operating Base Blackstone had been diverted to arms dealers. Intelligence reports warning of ambushes had been suppressed. Supply convoys had been deliberately routed through known danger zones. And at the center of it all, Colonel Davidson, playing both sides for profit while good soldiers paid the price with their lives. Elena had survived Forward Operating Base Blackstone not because of luck, but because she'd refused to follow orders that felt wrong. She'd taken her team off the prescribed route, trusted her instincts over official intelligence. 7 men had died because they'd followed protocol. 7 families had buried their sons and daughters because one man valued money over honor. The base commander called Elena into his office 3 days after Davidson's arrest. She expected questions, debriefings, maybe even accusations about her methods. Instead, she found herself facing a simple choice. She could return to active duty, accept the promotion and commendations that were rightfully hers, and move on with her career. Or she could stay at Fort Harrison as a civilian instructor, training the next generation to think critically, to question orders that didn't feel right, to trust their instincts even when authority demanded blind obedience. Elena looked out the window at the training grounds where new recruits were running drills, their faces bright with the same idealism she'd once carried. Some would make it, some wouldn't, but all of them deserved better than what she'd received, better than orders that prioritized profit over people, better than commanders who saw soldiers as expendable assets rather than human beings worth protecting. "I'll stay," she said quietly. The base commander nodded, unsurprised. He'd read her file, knew her story, understood what drove her. The military needed people like Elena Cross, people who'd been through hell and chosen to use that experience to light the way for others rather than simply survive it. The ceremony that followed was smaller than it should have been, quieter than she deserved. Elena stood in her dress uniform, the Medal of Honor properly displayed on her chest, as the base commander read the citation that had been sealed for 3 years. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty while serving as squad leader during combat operations at Forward Operating Base Blackstone. When her unit came under intense enemy fire and faced betrayal from within their own command structure, Sergeant Cross repeatedly exposed herself to hostile fire to evacuate wounded personnel, refused direct orders that would have led to greater casualties, and single-handedly held a defensive position against overwhelming odds. Her extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty are in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon herself, her unit, and the United States Army. Staff Sergeant Monroe was the first to salute when the reading finished. His face carried the weight of understanding now, the knowledge that he'd misjudged not just a person, but everything he thought he knew about courage, about leadership, about what it meant to wear the uniform. The other soldiers followed Monroe's lead, one by one, until the entire formation stood at attention, rendering the sharpest salutes of their careers. Elena returned the salute with quiet dignity, her auburn ponytail catching the afternoon sun that streamed through the windows of the Fort Harrison Ceremony Hall. This wasn't the recognition she'd wanted, but it was the recognition her fallen team deserved. The 7 men who hadn't made it back from Forward Operating Base Blackstone finally had their story told, their sacrifice acknowledged, their memory honored. In the weeks that followed, Elena settled into her new role as instructor. The young soldiers who came to her classes initially expected lectures about tactics and weapons handling. Instead, they found themselves learning about judgment, about the weight of decisions made under pressure, about the difference between following orders and doing what's right. She taught them to read terrain not just with their eyes but with their instincts, to trust their gut when something felt wrong, to understand that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against the enemy in front of you, but against the corruption behind you. Staff Sergeant Monroe became one of her most dedicated students. The man who'd once dismissed her as all shine and no substance now hung on every word, understanding finally that true strength wasn't about volume or bluster, but about the quiet confidence that comes from having been tested and proven. He approached her after one particularly intense training session, his face serious, his voice respectful. "Ma'am," he said, "I owe you an apology. Not just for the pack, not just for the disrespect, but for not seeing what was right in front of me." Elena looked at him with the same calm expression she'd worn that first day in the hangar. "We all see what we expect to see, Sergeant. The question is what we do when we realize we were wrong." Monroe nodded, understanding the lesson that went far beyond military tactics. 6 months later, Elena stood before a new class of recruits in the same hangar where her weathered canvas pack had been carelessly tossed, where the Medal of Honor had first rolled across the concrete floor, where everything had changed in an instant. The space looked different now, transformed from a place of dismissal and mockery into a classroom where real learning happened. The recruits sat in neat rows, their faces eager and attentive, hanging on every word as Elena walked them through scenarios that textbooks couldn't teach. Today's lesson was about Forward Operating Base Blackstone, about the mission that had cost 7 good soldiers their lives and nearly destroyed her own. She didn't spare the details, didn't sanitize the story to make it easier to digest. These young men and women needed to understand that war wasn't clean, that orders weren't always right, that sometimes survival meant making the hardest choice of all, the choice to disobey. When the ambush came, Elena told them, her voice steady and clear, we had 2 options. Follow the route our colonel had ordered, the one that intelligence said was clear, or trust our instincts that something was wrong. 7 of my teammates followed orders. I didn't. A young private in the front row raised her hand tentatively. "Ma'am, how did you know the orders were wrong?" Elena paused, remembering that night at Forward Operating Base Blackstone, the way the radio chatter had felled off, the way the supposed all-clear reports had come too fast, too clean. "You don't always know," she said finally, "but you learn to recognize when something doesn't feel right. When the intelligence is too perfect, when the timing is too convenient, when your gut tells you that someone is lying." The lesson wasn't just about military tactics. It was about thinking critically, about questioning authority when that authority had been compromised, about understanding that blind obedience could be just as dangerous as reckless rebellion. The same private spoke up again, her voice stronger now. "Ma'am, what happened to Colonel Davidson after the investigation?" Elena's expression darkened slightly. "Court-martial," dishonorable discharge, federal prison. But the damage was already done. 7 families lost their sons and daughters because one man chose profit over principle. The hangar fell silent as the weight of that reality settled over the recruits. These weren't abstract lessons about hypothetical scenarios. This was real, recent, and it had happened to the woman standing in front of them. Elena continued walking between the rows of seated soldiers, her auburn ponytail swaying as she moved. Colonel Davidson had convinced himself he was serving the greater good, she said. He told himself that a few diverted weapons shipments wouldn't matter, that the intelligence he suppressed wasn't critical, that the money he made on the side would fund better equipment for his troops. Every corrupt official tells themselves a story that makes them the hero. She stopped in front of Staff Sergeant Monroe, who now sat in the back row of every class she taught, no longer the arrogant squad leader, but a student eager to learn. Monroe met her gaze steadily. The shame of his initial treatment of her long since transformed into respect and determination to be better. The real lesson of Forward Operating Base Blackstone, Elena said, turning to address the entire class, isn't about tactics or equipment or intelligence gathering. It's about integrity. When you compromise your principles for convenience, for money, for career advancement, people die. Real people with real families who trusted you to do your job with honor. A young corporal near the window raised his hand. "Ma'am, how do we make sure we don't become like Colonel Davidson?" Elena smiled, the first genuine smile she'd shown during the lesson. "You ask that question every day for the rest of your career. The moment you stop asking it, the moment you think you're above temptation, that's when you become dangerous." As the class ended and the recruits filed out of the hangar, Elena noticed one soldier lingering behind. Private Jessica Chun, a young intelligence analyst who'd been unusually quiet during the lesson. She approached Elena's desk with obvious hesitation, clutching a manila folder against her chest. "Ma'am," Chun said quietly, "I think I found something you should see." Elena gestured for her to sit down. Chun opened the folder, revealing financial documents, communication logs, and shipping manifests. "It's about the supply contracts for Forward Operating Base Blackstone," she said. "I've been analyzing the data as part of my training, and the patterns are all wrong." Elena studied the documents carefully, her expression growing serious as she recognized the same irregularities that had first made her suspicious 3 years ago. "These contracts were signed after Colonel Davidson's arrest," Chun continued. "New colonel, same problems. Same shell companies, same routing anomalies, same financial discrepancies." Elena felt a familiar chill run down her spine. Davidson hadn't been working alone. The network was bigger than anyone had realized, and his removal had only caused the remaining players to be more careful, more subtle. "You're sure about this analysis, Private Chun?" Chun nodded firmly. "I've run it 3 times, ma'am. Cross-referenced it with legitimate contracts from other bases. The probability of these patterns occurring naturally is less than 1%. Elena leaned back in her chair, her mind racing through the implications. Fort Harrison was still compromised. Somewhere in the command structure, Davidson's replacement was continuing the same corruption that had killed her teammates at Forward Operating Base Blackstone. The difference was that this time, Elena wasn't a naive sergeant following orders. She was an instructor with credibility, connections, and most importantly, the knowledge of how to build an airtight case. She looked at Chun with newfound respect. "Private, how would you like to help me save some lives?" Chun's eyes brightened with determination. "Whatever you need, ma'am." 2 weeks later, Elena and Private Chun sat in a secure conference room with the base inspector general. The same black SUVs that had arrived after Davidson's exposure now lined up outside Fort Harrison once again. The evidence they'd assembled was overwhelming. Financial records showing millions in diverted funds. Communication intercepts proving coordination between military personnel and arms dealers. Shipping manifests that revealed weapons meant for frontline units being sold to the highest bidder instead. The new corruption went deeper than Davidson's operation had ever reached. Colonel Patricia Reeves, Davidson's replacement, had inherited more than just his command. She'd inherited his network, his contacts, and his complete disregard for the lives of the soldiers under her care. Elena watched through the conference room window as military police escorted Reeves to a waiting vehicle, her hands cuffed behind her back, her career over, her freedom forfeit. It should have felt like victory, but Elena only felt tired. How many more were there? How many other forward operating base Blackstones were waiting to happen because someone in authority had chosen money over honor? Private Chun touched her arm gently. "Ma'am, we stopped her. We saved lives today." Elena nodded, but her expression remained troubled. The inspector general approached their table, his face grave. "Sergeant Cross," he said, "we've identified at least 12 other installations with similar irregularities. We're going to need your help to investigate them all." Elena looked at Chun, saw the determination in the young woman's eyes, the same fire that had once driven Elena herself to question orders that felt wrong. Then she looked back at the inspector general and made her decision. "We'll need a bigger team," she said, "and better access to financial databases." The inspector general smiled for the first time since the briefing had begun. "You'll have whatever you need. Consider this your new assignment." Elena stood up, her auburn ponytail catching the light from the conference room windows, her Medal of Honor reflecting the afternoon sun streaming through the glass. 6 months into the expanded investigation, Elena found herself back in the same Fort Harrison hangar where everything had started, but this time she wasn't alone. A team of 12 investigators, analysts, and auditors worked at tables scattered throughout the space, their laptops and documents creating a command center dedicated to rooting out corruption across the military supply chain. Private Chun, now promoted to specialist, approached Elena's desk with another folder of evidence. This one was different. "Ma'am," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "we found the original orders for forward operating base Blackstone. The real ones, not the sanitized versions that made it into the official record." Elena opened the folder and felt her breath catch. The documents showed that Colonel Davidson had known about the ambush in advance. He'd received intelligence warnings 48 hours before her team deployed, detailed reports about enemy positions, planned attack routes, everything needed to avoid the trap. Instead of warning Elena's unit, he'd used the intelligence to position his arms dealer contacts to recover weapons from the aftermath. 7 soldiers had died, not in an unpredictable enemy ambush, but in a carefully orchestrated murder designed to generate profit. Elena's hands shook as she read through the communications between Davidson and his network. Her teammates' names appeared in the documents not as soldiers, but as acceptable losses, casualties that would provide cover for the weapons theft that followed. Staff Sergeant Monroe appeared in the hangar doorway, no longer the arrogant squad leader who'd once dismissed Elena, but now a trusted member of her investigative team. He saw the expression on her face and immediately understood. "Man, what do we find?" Elena handed him the folder without a word. Monroe read the first page, then the second, his face growing pale with each revelation. "Those bastards," he whispered. "They knew. They planned it." Elena stood up slowly, her auburn ponytail catching the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. This wasn't just corruption anymore. This was premeditated murder disguised as military operations. 1 year later, Elena Cross stood at Arlington National Cemetery before 7 white headstones, each bearing the name of a soldier who had died at Forward Operating Base Blackstone. The investigation she'd led had resulted in 43 arrests, the recovery of over $200 million in stolen military assets, and the complete restructuring of supply chain oversight across all branches of the armed forces. But none of that brought back the 7 men whose graves she visited every month. Specialist Chun approached quietly, carrying a wreath of white roses. She placed it at the base of the center headstone, the one belonging to Sergeant Marcus Williams, the team leader who tried to convince Elena to follow Davidson's route that fatal night. "Ma'am," Chun said softly, "the memorial service is starting." Elena nodded, but didn't move immediately. She touched the Medal of Honor on her chest, thinking about the weight it carried, not just in bronze and ribbon, but in responsibility and memory. The medal wasn't hers. It belonged to all 7 of these men, to their families, to every soldier who'd ever trusted their leadership to make the right decisions, even when those decisions were hard. The memorial service at Fort Harrison drew hundreds of attendees. Military personnel, family members, government officials, and journalists gathered in the same hangar where Elena's weathered canvas pack had once been carelessly tossed, where a Medal of Honor had rolled across concrete and changed everything. As Elena took the podium, she looked out at faces both familiar and new. Staff Sergeant Monroe sat in the front row next to Specialist Chun. The base commander who'd given her the choice to stay as an instructor occupied a place of honor. Even the inspector general who'd expanded her investigation had come to pay his respects. Some heroes choose to live in the shadows, Elena began, her voice carrying clearly through the hangar. They carry the weight of classified truths and unacknowledged sacrifices. They never ask for recognition, even when they deserve more than anyone else. And sometimes when a moment demands it, they step back into the light. They remind us that the quietest among us may carry the heaviest burdens.